This is London in 1666, one of the largest and busiest cities in Europe. Its streets were narrow, its houses were built of timber, and its people lived packed together in a city that still looked deeply medieval. Over 500,000 lives moved through a maze of wooden lanes, smoky workshops, crowded markets, and church spires that rose above rooftops stretching all the way to the River Thames. London was ancient, it was dense, and it was built almost entirely of wood. Then, in just a few days, fire turned much of it into ruins. Before the smoke, before the panic, before the skyline collapsed, this is what London looked like when the Great Fire destroyed the city. We are going to walk through London as it stood in the late summer of 1666, step by step. First, we will see the city itself, its streets, its buildings, its river, and the way ordinary people lived inside it. Then, we will follow the fire from its first spark to its final reach and understand why this particular city was so vulnerable to exactly this kind of disaster. And finally, we will see what London looked like after the flames went out and how those 4 days changed the city forever. To understand the Great Fire, you first have to understand the city it destroyed. London in 1666 was the largest city in England by a very wide margin. The greater area held somewhere around 400,000 people. Inside the old city walls alone, roughly 100,000 lived and worked in an area of less than 1 square mile. That is an extraordinary density, even by modern standards, and the buildings that held all those people were not stone towers or brick terraces. They were timber-framed houses, most of them several stories tall, built so close together that in many streets the upper floors nearly touched. The City of London sat on the north bank of the River Thames. It was enclosed by a medieval wall that still stood in most places, roughly 18 feet high, with 8 main gates that controlled the flow of traffic in and out. Moorgate, Bishopsgate, Aldgate, Ludgate, these were names that every Londoner knew. The wall was old, patched in places, and no longer truly defensive, but it still defined the boundary of the city proper. Inside the walls, the streets were narrow, winding, and unplanned. London had grown organically over centuries, and its layout reflected that. Main thoroughfares like Cheapside and Cornhill were wide enough for carts and market stalls, but most side streets and alleys were barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. Some lanes were so tight that a person could stretch out both arms and touch the walls on either side. The houses were the most important feature of this city because they explain everything that happened next. Most of London's residential buildings were timber-framed. Oak beams formed the skeleton, and the spaces between were filled with plaster, lath, or wattle and daub. The roofs were a mix of tile and thatch, and the critical detail was this. The upper stories of these houses projected outward over the street. Each floor overhung the one below it, so that by the time you looked up from street level, the buildings on either side were leaning toward each other, sometimes leaving only a sliver of sky above. This style of building, called jettying, had been common in English towns for centuries. It gave families more living space on the upper floors, but it also meant that fire could leap from one side of the street to the other with terrifying ease. King Charles II had actually warned about this. In 1661, he ordered that no new buildings should be constructed with overhanging jetties. In 1665, the year before the fire, he wrote to the Lord Mayor warning that the narrow streets and timber houses posed a serious fire risk. But the warnings were ignored. London kept building the way it had always built, behind and beneath the houses, the yards and cellars were full of combustible material. Timber was stacked for building. Barrels of pitch, tar and tallow were stored for trade. Hay was kept for horses. Coal and firewood were piled for heating. London, in 1666, was not just a city made of wood. It was a city saturated with things that burned. And it had been a dangerously dry summer. By late August, London had gone months with very little rain. The timber was dry, the thatch was dry, the air was warm and still. The city was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. But none of that was on anyone's mind on a normal day in London. The city was alive with commerce. Along the Thames, the wharves and docks were crowded with ships, barges, and watermen ferrying passengers across the river. London Bridge, the only bridge crossing the Thames within the city, carried traffic, shops, and houses along its full length. It was a street in the sky, built on 20 stone arches, nearly 1,000 feet long. The markets were the pulse of the city. Cheapside was the great commercial street, lined with goldsmiths, drapers, and merchants. Leadenhall handled meat and leather. Billingsgate dealt in fish. Street vendors pushed through the crowd, selling bread, fruit, coal, and milk. Above the rooftops, the spires of 109 churches rose against the sky. And towering above them all was old St. Paul's Cathedral, one of the longest churches in Europe, with a massive nave and a tower that dominated London's western skyline. St. Paul's was more than a church. Its nave, known as Paul's Walk, was a place where people met to do business, exchange gossip, and hire servants. It was the social centre of the city. This was London on the last day of August 1666. Dense, wooden, wealthy, loud, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. In the early hours of Sunday, the 2nd of September 1666, a fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane. The bakery belonged to Thomas Fariner, the King's baker. The exact cause is uncertain. It may have been an unattended oven, a stray spark landing on a pile of fuel. Whatever started it, by around 1 o'clock in the morning, the fire had taken hold of the building. Fariner and most of his family escaped through an upstairs window, climbing across the rooftops to a neighbour's house. A maidservant, too frightened to follow, did not make it out. She was the first to die. By 2 or 3 in the morning, the fire had spread to the neighbouring houses. Church bells began ringing in alarm. The glow was visible from a quarter-mile away. Neighbours formed lines to pass buckets of water, but the flames were already beyond what buckets could manage. The Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was woken and brought to the scene. He looked at the fire and, according to multiple accounts, dismissed it. He reportedly said that a woman could put it out with a simple act of stamping on it. He refused to order the demolition of surrounding houses to create a firebreak because he did not want to pay the cost of rebuilding them. It was one of the worst decisions in the history of London. By dawn, the fire had reached the warehouses along the Thames waterfront. These buildings were packed with oil, spirits, tallow, and other highly flammable goods. When the flames hit the stores, the fire intensified dramatically. Explosions echoed along the river. Columns of smoke rose hundreds of feet into the air. The wind was blowing hard from the east. It pushed the fire westward through the narrow streets. Jumping from rooftop to rooftop, racing through the dry timber frames faster than people could react. By mid-morning on Sunday, more than 300 houses had been destroyed, and the fire was accelerating. London had no organised fire service. There was no coordinated response. The few hand-operated water pumps that existed were slow, weak, and far too few. The only proven method for stopping a major urban fire was pulling down buildings ahead of the flames to create a gap the fire could not cross. But the Lord Mayor had refused to give the order, and by the time King Charles intervened, precious hours had been lost. By Monday morning, the fire had become something no one in London had ever seen before. It was no longer a fire, it was a wall of flame moving through the city. The wind had not dropped. If anything, the heat of the fire itself was now generating its own wind, pulling air in from the sides and feeding the blaze with fresh oxygen. Streets that had been standing an hour earlier were now corridors of fire. The heat was so intense that lead from church roofs was melting and running in streams down the gutters. King Charles II took control. He placed his brother, James, the Duke of York, in charge of firefighting operations. Soldiers were deployed, fire posts were established at key points around the city, and the demolition of buildings finally began in earnest, with teams of men pulling down houses with hooks and ropes, and in some cases using gunpowder to blast them apart. But the fire moved faster than the fire breaks could be built. On Monday, the Royal Exchange burned. It was one of the great commercial buildings of London, where merchants from across Europe met to trade. It stood for barely an hour once the fire reached it. On Tuesday, the fire reached Cheapside, the widest and richest street in the city. The grand houses and shops that lined it caught fire one after another. The Guildhall, the seat of London's civic government, burned through Tuesday night. Its stone walls held, but the interior was gutted and the lead roof melted. The streets were chaos. Thousands of Londoners were fleeing with whatever they could carry. Carts were loaded with furniture, clothing, and household goods. People dragged chests through the streets, dropped them, picked them up again. The narrow lanes were jammed with families moving in every direction, some heading for the city gates, others making for the river. The Thames became an escape route. Small boats and barges ferried people and their belongings across to the south bank. From the water, the view was almost impossible to process. The entire north bank of the river seemed to be on fire. Smoke rose in a column that could be seen for miles. Samuel Pepys, the diarist, watched from across the river and described the scene. The fire was an entire arch of flame, stretching from one side of the visible city to the other. Pigeons, he wrote, circled above their burning rooftops, unwilling to leave until their wings caught fire and they fell. By Tuesday evening, the fire had reached its greatest extent. It stretched from the Temple in the west to near the Tower of London in the east. Nearly the entire city within the walls was either burning or already destroyed. And then the fire came for St. Paul's. Old St. Paul's Cathedral had stood for nearly 600 years. It was surrounded by a large churchyard, and many people believed the open space would protect it. Booksellers had moved their stock into the cathedral's stone crypt for safety, but the scaffolding from Wren's ongoing restoration work was made of wood. The roof was covered in lead over timber beams. When the fire reached St. Paul's on Tuesday night, the scaffolding caught first, then the roof timbers, the lead melted and poured down the walls. According to one account, the stones of the cathedral exploded in the heat, sending fragments flying through the air. The books stored in the crypt burned for days. The destruction of St. Paul's was the symbolic peak of the Great Fire. The greatest church in the city, the landmark that had defined London's skyline for centuries, was gone. On Wednesday, the 4th of September, two things changed. The wind dropped. After days of relentless easterly gusts, the air grew calmer. Without the wind to drive it, the fire began to lose momentum, and the fire breaks finally worked. At the eastern edge of the city, the garrison of the Tower of London used gunpowder to blow up houses around the fortress, creating a wide gap that the fire could not cross. The tower was saved. To the north, similar firebreaks held at Cripplegate and Smithfield. By Wednesday evening, the main body of the fire was dying. Scattered outbreaks continued for another day. A final flare-up near Bishopsgate was contained by early Thursday morning. After 4 days, the Great Fire of London was over. The scale of what had happened was difficult to comprehend. Roughly 4/5 of the city within the walls had been destroyed. 13,200 houses were gone. 87 of the city's 109 churches had burned. St. Paul's Cathedral, the Royal Exchange, the Guildhall, dozens of livery company halls and countless warehouses, shops and workshops were in ruins. Around 100,000 people had lost their homes. Only 6 deaths were officially recorded, but the true number was almost certainly higher. The fire burned hot enough to destroy bone. Many of the poorest residents, those living in cellars and attics, may have had no chance to escape and no one to record their absence. In the days after the fire, London was unrecognizable. Where there had been streets packed with timber houses and the noise of 100,000 lives, there was now silence. Blackened walls stood without roofs, chimneys rose above nothing. The ground was covered in ash, rubble, and the stumps of burned beams. In places, the debris was still too hot to walk across. Smoke drifted through the ruins for weeks. The survivors had fled to the open fields outside the city walls, to Moorfields and Islington and beyond. Tent cities appeared overnight. Families camped in whatever shelter they could find, surrounded by the few belongings they had managed to carry out. The government distributed bread and opened emergency markets, but the shock was immense. London, the greatest city in England, the centre of trade, law and power, had been gutted in 4 days. Almost immediately, plans for rebuilding began. King Charles saw the disaster as an opportunity. Within days, he announced that the new London would be built differently. Streets would be wider. Buildings would be constructed of brick and stone, not timber. Fire regulations would be enforced. The old medieval tangle of narrow lanes and wooden houses would not be rebuilt. Several architects, including Christopher Wren and John Evelyn, submitted grand plans for a new London with wide boulevards, open squares, and rational geometric layouts. These plans were ambitious and beautiful, but they were also impractical. The city's landowners wanted to rebuild on their existing plots. The legal disputes over property lines would have taken years to resolve. Commerce could not wait. In the end, London was rebuilt largely on its old medieval street plan. The lanes kept their names, the plots kept their boundaries, but the buildings changed. Brick replaced timber, stone replaced wood. The overhanging jetties disappeared, streets were widened where possible, and Christopher Wren was given the task of rebuilding the churches. Over the next 4 decades, he designed 51 new churches across the city, each one different, each one adapted to its site. And at the heart of it all, he built a new St. Paul's Cathedral, the domed masterpiece that still stands today, one of the most recognized buildings in the world. The Great Fire did not just destroy London, it ended one version of the city and began another. The London that burned in 1666 was a medieval city. Its bones were Saxon and Norman. Its streets had been walked for centuries, its timber houses, its narrow lanes, its overhanging upper stories. These were the physical remains of a city that had grown slowly, organically, over hundreds of years. The London that rose from the ashes was something new. It was a city of brick, of wider streets, of regulated building codes. It was the beginning of the modern city. The fire killed remarkably few people, at least by the official count, but it erased a world. The old London, the London of wood and smoke and medieval density, was gone, and it was never coming back. In September of 1666, London was not just a city that caught fire, it was a city that had been building toward this moment for centuries. Every timber beam, every overhanging jetty, every dry cellar packed with tar and hay, the city itself was the fuel. The fire did not come from outside, it came from within, from a single bakery on a single street, on a dry summer night when the wind was blowing in the worst possible direction. And in 4 days it changed London forever. The old city is gone. But if you walk through London today, along the lanes that still carry their medieval names, past the churches that Christopher Wren built on the ashes of the ones that burned, you are walking through the memory of what was lost. This is what London looked like in 1666, when the Great Fire destroyed the city. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoy this kind of deep historical reconstruction, please subscribe to Walter Reconstructs History. I make videos that bring lost cities, decisive moments, and great turning points back to life in a way that is simple, visual, and grounded in real history. And if there is another lost city, forgotten battle, or vanished world you want to see rebuilt, leave it in the comments. What should I reconstruct next on Walter Reconstructs History?